The date was January 22nd, 1943. The time was exactly 9:17 in the morning.
Keep your eyes
Though
peeled.
the concept of
There's
time
something
had
out there.
largely lost
Stay
its
sharp.
meaning in the rotting
Slow.
green hell of Guadalcanal. Second Lieutenant John George was not a typical soldier, and the weapon resting on the sandbags in front of him was certainly not a typical weapon. He was crouched inside the shattered remains of a Japanese log bunker, positioned on the western edge of the Guadalcanal River sector, staring through a telescopic sight that his fellow officers had spent the last 6 weeks mocking. To the rest of the 132nd Infantry Regiment, John George was a 27-year-old eccentric from Illinois who treated a global war like a deer hunting trip. But as he wiped the sweat from his brow and settled the crosshairs on a massive banyan tree 240 yards away, the laughter had long since died away. The men of his platoon were no longer laughing because they were too busy dying. The Japanese Imperial Army had turned the coconut groves west of Point Cruz into a slaughterhouse. For 72 hours, an elite detachment of Japanese snipers had pinned down the American advance, picking off officers, corpsmen, and water carriers with terrifying impunity. They had killed 14 men from George's regiment in 3 days. The morale of the unit was disintegrating. The invisible enemy in the trees had created a zone of denial where to stand up was to die, and to stay still was to wait for death to find you. The American response had been ineffective. Mortars couldn't find the snipers in the dense canopy. Machine guns sprayed the jungle blindly, wasting ammunition on shadows. The standard-issue M1 Garand, the greatest battle implement ever devised, was a hammer. The situation at Point Cruz required a scalpel, and John George was holding the only scalpel in the entire battalion. The rifle was a Winchester Model 70, chambered in .30-06. In the civilian world, it was known as the rifleman's rifle, a masterpiece of blued steel and walnut intended for hunting elk in the Rockies or white-tailed deer in the Midwest. It was a bolt-action weapon holding 5 rounds in an internal magazine. It was slow, heavy, and delicate compared to the rugged semi-automatic Garands carried by the other men. Mounted on top was a Lyman Alaskan 2.5 power scope, secured by a Griffin & Howe side mount. When George had first unpacked this weapon at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the battalion armorer had looked at him with genuine confusion, asking if the lieutenant intended to hunt deer or Germans. George had replied, with a flat, serious tone, that he intended to hunt the Japanese. The journey of that rifle was a testament to George's obsession. When the 132nd Infantry shipped out for the Pacific, his commanding officer, Captain Morris, had ordered him to leave the sporting toy behind. George, a stubborn Illinois state shooting champion, had ignored the order. He arranged for the rifle to be shipped separately through the military mail system. He spent the long, anxious voyage across the Pacific watching other officers clean their service weapons while he worried about his Winchester sitting in a crate somewhere in the belly of a logistics ship. It wasn't until late December of 1942, 6 weeks after they landed, that a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked "Fragile." Inside, packed in heavy grease to protect it from the salt air, was the weapon he had saved 2 years of National Guard pay to buy. It weighed nearly 10 pounds with the scope, heavy, cumbersome, and utterly perfect for the job at hand. The context of his deployment was grim. The 132nd Infantry had arrived on Guadalcanal to relieve the exhausted Marines who had been holding the line since August. The Marines had secured Henderson Field, the critical airstrip that allowed American air power to dominate the Solomons. But the island was far from secure. The Japanese forces had retreated into the jungle highlands and the coastal groves, digging into the earth like badgers. George's battalion had spent late December throwing themselves against a fortified Japanese position known as the Gifu, located on Mount Austin. It was a vertical hell of mud and hidden bunkers. They had fought for 16 days, losing 34 men killed and nearly 300 wounded, to take a single slope. During that entire engagement, George had carried his Winchester, but he had never fired it. The fighting had been too close, too chaotic. It was a war of grenades and bayonets, not precision marksmanship. But Point Cruz was different. Here, the terrain flattened out into dense coconut groves and tangled jungle, dominated by ancient banyan trees that rose 90 feet into the humid air. These trees were natural fortresses. Their trunks were massive, often 8 feet thick, composed of tangled aerial roots that offered endless hiding spots. A sniper could climb a banyan before dawn, tie himself into the canopy with rope, and remain invisible all day. The Japanese snipers operating here were veterans. They used Arisaka Type 97 sniper rifles with low-power optics. They used smokeless powder to conceal their positions, and they possessed a patience that unnerved the Americans. They didn't shoot just anyone. They waited for the leaders. On January 19th, a single shot rang out near the water point, killing Corporal Davis instantly as he filled canteens. On January 20th, 2 men from L Company were dropped while on patrol, shot by a sniper they never saw. On January 21st, the breaking point arrived. 3 more men died, including a popular sergeant, shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. The battalion commander, a man worn down by the constant attrition and the heat, summoned Lieutenant George to his tent that night. The skepticism about the mail-order sweetheart rifle was gone. The commander didn't care if George used a musket, as long as he could stop the bleeding. He asked George one question: could he actually hit what he aimed at? George didn't boast. He simply recited his resume. He had won the Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards in 1939. At 23, he had been the youngest winner in the state's history. He could place 5 rounds inside a 4-inch circle at 300 yards. He knew windage, he knew ballistics, and he knew how to read the mirage on a hot day. The commander looked at him, his face gaunt in the lantern light, and gave him a simple order: fix it. He gave George until morning to prove that his civilian target rifle belonged in a war zone. George spent that night preparing for his hunt. He sat in his tent, shielding the light with a poncho, and stripped the Winchester down to its component parts. He wiped away the last traces of cosmoline. He checked the screws on the Griffin and Howe mount, tightening them to the breaking point to ensure the scope wouldn't shift under recoil. He sorted through his ammunition, selecting 5 rounds of .30-06 military ball ammo, the same cartridges used by the machine gunners, but George checked each one for deformities. He polished the brass. He treated the weapon with the reverence of a religious artifact. He knew that tomorrow there would be no second chances. If he missed his first shot, the Japanese snipers would see his muzzle flash. They would see the distinct profile of a scoped rifle, and they would focus every gun in the sector on him. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into the ruins of the Japanese bunker. It was a filthy, cramped position, smelling of wet earth and rotting vegetation, but it offered a commanding view of the groves. He settled in, building a steady shooting platform with sandbags. He didn't bring a spotter. He didn't bring a radio. He brought his rifle, a canteen of warm water, and 60 rounds of ammunition on stripper clips. He was playing a dangerous game of solitaire. He began to scan. The Lyman Alaskan scope offered only 2.5 power magnification. To modernize, this would seem inadequate, but in the dense jungle of 1943, it was a revelation. It allowed George to penetrate the shadows that the naked eye glossed over. He learned quickly that the jungle was never truly still. The wind moved the upper branches. Birds moved the lower ones. But a man moved differently. A man had weight. A man-made branches sag in a way that nature did not. George divided the jungle into sectors, scanning from left to right, top to bottom, dissecting every tree. At 9:17, the patience paid off. 240 yards away, high in the canopy of a massive banyan, a single branch dipped against the wind. It was a subtle movement, visible only for a fraction of a second, but George froze. He focused the scope. Slowly, the chaotic shapes of leaves and vines resolved into something geometric. A shoulder, a helmet rim, a dark patch of clothing in the fork of the tree, 87 feet off the ground. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the trail used by the American supply runners. He was waiting for a target. He had no idea that he had become one. George adjusted his position, shifting his hips to align his spine with the rifle. He checked the wind, negligible at ground level, perhaps 5 miles per hour at the treetop. He held 2 inches of windage to the right. He exhaled, emptying his lungs halfway, and paused. The trigger of the Model 70 was tuned to a crisp 3.5 pounds. It broke like a glass rod. Crack. The rifle bucked into his shoulder. The report echoed through the humid air, a sharp, whip-like sound distinct from the dull thud of the Garands. Through the scope, George saw the impact. The Japanese sniper jerked violently, his hands flailing as he lost his grip on the branch. He fell backward, tumbling through the canopy, hitting limbs and vines on the way down before striking the jungle floor with a heavy, final thud. 90 feet. No one survived that fall. George cycled the bolt immediately, the smooth action ejecting the spent brass and feeding a fresh round. He didn't celebrate. He didn't relax. He kept his eye on the scope. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. If there was one, there was likely another. He waited. 10 minutes passed. 20. The jungle, silenced by the shot, began to chirp and buzz again. George scanned the trees adjacent to the first kill. The spotter would be close, likely frozen in place, terrified to move. But fear makes men stiff, and stiffness leads to fatigue, and fatigue leads to movement. At 9:43, George caught a flicker of motion 60 yards north of the first tree. It was lower, perhaps 50 feet up. The second sniper was trying to climb down. He had realized his position was compromised and was attempting to retreat to the ground. It was a fatal mistake. George tracked him through the scope, leading the target slightly as he descended the trunk. He fired. The bullet took the sniper high in the back. He peeled off the tree trunk and fell, his rifle clattering through the branches ahead of him. 2 shots, 2 kills. The battalion was waking up to the sound of the Winchester. Men in nearby foxholes, who had spent days keeping their heads down, began to peek over the parapets. They knew the sound of that rifle. It was the sound of the tables turning. But the Japanese were not passive targets. They were veterans of campaigns in China and Malaya. They realized quickly that a new threat had entered the battle space. At 11:21, a 6.5 millimeter bullet slammed into the sandbag 6 inches from George's face. The impact sprayed dirt into his eyes and filled the bunker with the sharp smell of ozone. George rolled left, pressing himself into the dirt floor. The shot had come from the southwest. He had been spotted. He lay there for 3 minutes, his heart hammering against his ribs. A lesser sniper would have fired back immediately, spraying bullets at the suspected source. George did nothing. He waited. He let the enemy think they had suppressed him or killed him. Slowly, inch by inch, he raised his head back to the optic. He didn't look at where the bullet hit. He looked at where it came from. The shooter would have moved. That was standard doctrine: shoot and relocate. But in a banyan tree, relocation was slow. You had to untie yourself, climb to a new branch, and reset. At 11:38, George found him. Third tree from the left in a cluster of heavy timber, 73 feet up. The sniper had shifted branches but stayed in the same tree. He was scanning the bunker, looking for the American he thought he had pinned down. George centered the crosshairs on the man's chest. The distance was shorter this time, maybe 180 yards. An easy shot for a state champion. George squeezed the trigger. The third sniper slumped forward, caught by his safety rope, dangling lifelessly from the limb like a grim ornament. By noon, the tally was 5. 5 Japanese snipers, the invisible terrors of Point Cruz, were dead. The atmosphere in the American lines shifted from dread to electric excitement. Soldiers crawled up to George's bunker, offering him cigarettes, water, anything, just to get a look at the man with the hunting rifle. George waved them away. "Get back," he hissed. "You're drawing fire." He knew that the game had changed. The first 5 kills were targets of opportunity. The remaining snipers now knew he existed. They knew his location, and they would be hunting him as aggressively as he hunted them. George returned to headquarters at 1600 hours. He was exhausted, his shoulder bruised from the recoil, his eyes burning from hours of squinting through the glass. Captain Morris met him at the perimeter. There were no jokes about the toy rifle this time. Morris looked at the weary lieutenant with a mixture of relief and respect. "Be back in that hole at dawn," Morris said. "We're just getting started." The next morning, January 23rd, brought a torrential tropical downpour. The rain hammered the jungle, turning the floor into a slurry of black mud and reducing visibility to 0. George sat in the bunker, water dripping from the log roof onto his helmet, shielding the Winchester's action with his body. He waited. Patience was the sniper's primary weapon. The rifle was just a tool. When the rain finally broke at 8:45, the jungle steamed in the returning sun. The air was thick enough to chew. The Japanese had used the rain to move. At 9:12, George spotted a sniper who had repositioned during the storm. This one was clever. He had chosen a tree nearly 300 yards out, pushing the effective range of combat shooting. He assumed he was safe at that distance. He was wrong. George adjusted his hold, compensating for the bullet drop. He fired. The 6th sniper fell. But this shot triggered a reaction George hadn't anticipated. The Japanese had realized that counter-sniping wasn't working. They decided to use brute force. At 9:57, a mortar shell whistled in and detonated 40 yards short of the bunker. Then another, 20 yards short. They were walking the rounds in. They had triangulated his position. George didn't hesitate. He grabbed the Winchester and sprinted out the back of the bunker, diving into a muddy drainage ditch just as the 3rd salvo landed. The bunker he had occupied seconds earlier vanished in a cloud of dirt and splintered logs. He lay in the mud, debris raining down on his back. They had destroyed his nest, but they hadn't killed the bird. George wiped the mud from his scope lenses, checked the action, and began to crawl north. He needed a new position. The duel was escalating, and the easy kills were over. Now, only the experts remained. John George crawled 120 yards north through the undergrowth, the mud soaking through his fatigues until he reached the hollow of a massive fallen tree. This would be his new killing floor. The Japanese mortar team had bracketed his old bunker with terrifying precision, proving that his enemy was no longer just reacting, they were hunting him. The dynamic of the battlefield had shifted from a turkey shoot to a high-stakes game of chess played with high-velocity lead. George wiped the debris from the lens of his Lyman Alaskan scope and settled in. He didn't have to wait long. The Japanese snipers, pressured by their officers to eliminate the American marksman, began to take risks. That afternoon, George killed his 7th and 8th targets. The 8th sniper had made a fatal error of judgment. He had climbed nearly 94 feet up a banyan tree, seeking a commanding view. While the height gave him excellent lines of sight, It also silhouetted him against the bright tropical sky when the sun dipped low in the afternoon. George spotted the unnatural shape against the blue, calculated the angle, and fired. The man fell for what seemed like seconds before crashing through the canopy. At 1700 hours, Captain Morris summoned George back to the perimeter. George reported 8 confirmed kills for 12 rounds fired. It was a ratio of efficiency that bordered on the mechanical. Morris listened, nodded, and ordered him back out at dawn. January 24th began with a gray, weeping sky. The rain turned the Point Cruz groves into a blurred watercolor painting, delaying operations until nearly 9 in the morning. George used the weather to relocate again. He knew the Japanese would be watching the fallen tree, just as they had watched the bunker. He needed a position they wouldn't expect. He chose a cluster of jagged rocks 70 yards south, the site of an old Marine machine gun nest that had been abandoned weeks ago. It offered jagged cover and overlapping fields of fire. At 8:17, the rain slowed to a drizzle and the jungle woke up. Almost immediately, George spotted a target, sniper number 9. But something was wrong. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree only 190 yards away, perched dangerously low, barely 40 feet off the ground. The palm fronds offered decent concealment, but the position was tactically unsound. It was too obvious, too vulnerable. George's finger hovered over the trigger of the Winchester, but he didn't squeeze. His instincts, sharpened by 3 days of continuous hunting, screamed a warning. This was bait. The Japanese knew George was out there. They knew he was good. So they had offered him an easy kill, a sacrificial lamb to draw his fire. George knew that the moment he shot the man in the palm, another sniper, the real threat, would be watching for his muzzle flash. George lowered the rifle slightly and began to scan the trees behind the palm. He ignored the bait and hunted the hunter. It took 11 agonizing minutes of grid-searching the canopy. Then he found him. 80 yards northwest of the decoy, hidden deep in a banyan tree 91 feet up, was the 10th sniper. He was tucked into a perfect hide, his rifle trained not on the trail, but on the likely American firing positions. He was waiting for George to take the bait. George formulated a plan that relied on split-second timing. He aimed at the decoy in the palm tree first. Crack! The bait fell. George immediately racked the bolt, ejecting the casing, and swung the muzzle toward the high banyan tree. As he predicted, the real sniper reacted to the sound of the shot, shifting his body to locate George. That shift was his death warrant. George fired his second round before the Japanese sniper could complete his turn. The bullet struck him center mass. 2 shots, 2 kills. But the game was up. George had revealed his position. He grabbed his kit and scrambled east, diving into a muddy drainage ditch just as a Japanese Nambu machine gun tore apart the rocks he had occupied 6 seconds earlier. The stones splintered under the impact of the heavy rounds. They had been waiting for him. George counted to 60, letting the adrenaline settle, then moved again. He crawled another 100 yards east to a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. It was a miserable position, waist-deep in brown sludge, smelling of rot, but it offered a low profile. He waded into the water, resting the Winchester on the muddy rim. He had 10 kills. Intelligence estimated 11 snipers in the sector. That meant 1 remained. The survivor. The best of the pack. For an hour, nothing moved. George scanned the trees, but the 11th sniper wasn't in the trees. At 9:47, George caught a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision, low to the ground. 60 yards south. It wasn't a branch in the wind. It was a man. The final sniper had abandoned the canopy. He was crawling through the ferns, moving parallel to the tree line, hunting George on the ground. He was moving toward the rocks George had just fled, tracking him by the sound of the last shots. George watched through the scope as the Japanese hunter crept closer. The man moved with terrifying patience, inching forward, pausing, listening. He reached the rocks at 10:03 and set up, facing the drainage ditch where he assumed George was hiding. His back was to George's new position in the water crater. It was a clear shot, 38 yards, exposed back. An execution. But George didn't fire. The same instinct that had saved him from the palm tree bait flared again. This ground sniper was too exposed. He was another decoy. George scanned the area around the rocks. At 10:06, he saw the final piece of the puzzle. 70 yards northwest, behind a fallen log, lay a 12th Japanese soldier. He was the overwatch. The Japanese were hunting in a team, sweeping the ground. George was trapped. He couldn't shoot one without the other returning fire before he could cycle the bolt of his Winchester. He needed them closer. He needed surprise. George lowered himself into the crater until the water reached his chin. He held the rifle vertically to keep the action dry. He became part of the swamp. At 10:13, the sniper in the rocks stood up, frustrated. He signaled to his partner. They began to move east, sweeping the area, walking right past George's crater. They were 40 yards away, their backs exposed, moving toward the tree line. George rose from the water like a specter. He shouldered the rifle, water streaming from his face. He fired at the nearest man. Drop. Bolt back. Bolt forward. He swung to the second man. Drop. The Winchester's report echoed flatly over the water, but the silence that followed was broken by shouting. A Japanese infantry patrol, attracted by the gunfire, was crashing through the brush toward the bodies. George was out of position, out of time, and down to 3 rounds of ammunition. He didn't run immediately. He dropped back into the water, submerging until only his eyes and the muzzle broke the surface. The patrol reached the rim of the crater. A Japanese soldier looked down, staring right at him. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier collapsed backward. George worked the bolt underwater, rose, and fired again at the 2 men behind him. He scrambled out of the crater, sliding in the mud, and sprinted for the tree line as bullets snapped through the air around him. He dove behind a log, fired his last round at a pursuer, and ran until his lungs burned. He reached the American perimeter with an empty rifle and a story that sounded like fiction. 11 snipers killed, 3 infantrymen dead in the final scramble. A sector that had paralyzed an entire battalion had been cleared by 1 man with a hunting rifle. But the war wasn't over for John George. Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander, realized that George was a resource too valuable to risk in solitary duels. He ordered George to stand down and establish a sniper school. They gave him 14 Marines who were expert marksmen and equipped them with Springfield M1903 rifles fitted with Unertl scopes. George taught them everything: how to read the wind in the trees, how to build a hide, and, most importantly, the patience to wait for the perfect shot. The sniper section went to work in February. In 12 days, they killed 74 Japanese soldiers, with 0 friendly casualties. They broke the back of the Japanese rearguard during the evacuation of Guadalcanal. George led them until February 7th, when his luck finally ran out near the Tanambogo River. A Japanese rifleman put a bullet through his shoulder. It was a clean wound, missing the bone, but it ended his campaign on the island. While recovering in the hospital, George volunteered for a new classified mission gathering in India. The unit was officially the 500-307th Composite Unit, provisional, but the world would come to know them as Merrill's Marauders. George packed his Winchester Model 70, now fitted with a lighter Weaver 330 scope to save weight, and shipped out for the jungles of Burma. The terrain there was even worse than Guadalcanal: steep mountains, leech-infested swamps, and deep penetration missions behind enemy lines. The Winchester traveled 700 miles on George's back. He used it sparingly in Burma, firing only 7 shots in combat, but each one was a confirmed kill at ranges where the standard carbines were useless. One shot dropped a Japanese officer directing troops at 412 yards across a river valley. But as the war dragged on, George realized that the era of the lone hunter was fading. The volume of fire from semi-automatic weapons like the M1 Garand and the sheer industrial scale of the conflict were making the bolt-action rifle a relic. After Burma, the Marauders were disbanded, decimated by disease and casualties. George returned to the United States in July 1944, a captain with 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. He spent the rest of the war at Fort Benning, teaching young officers how to shoot. He kept his Winchester in a footlocker, cleaning it religiously, a steel connection to the green hell of Point Cruz. After the war, John George put down the rifle and picked up a pen. He attended Princeton and Oxford, becoming an expert in African affairs and a diplomat. But in 1947, urged by friends at the National Rifle Association, he wrote a book titled Shots Fired in Anger. It was a masterpiece of technical analysis and combat memoir, stripping away the mythology of war to reveal the cold, hard ballistics of survival. It remains one of the definitive texts on World War II small arms. John George died in 2009 at the age of 90. He didn't die in a jungle, but in peace. His rifle, the Winchester Model 70 that he had bought with saved National Guard pay, the mail-order sweetheart that had been mocked by his peers, resides today in the National Firearms Museum in Virginia. Thousands of people walk past it every year. To most, it looks like just another old hunting rifle, indistinguishable from the ones used to hunt deer in the 1940s. But if you look closely at the stock, you can see the wear marks from the humid grip of a man sweating in a bunker. It is a silent witness to 4 days in January 1943, when one man and one rifle did what an entire infantry battalion could not. It is the steel embodiment of the sniper's creed. One shot, one kill. This is the story of John George, the man who brought a hunting rifle to a world war and won. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to help us preserve history. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss a forgotten tale of heroism. And tell us in the comments, would you trust a bolt-action rifle in the jungle, or would you want the firepower of a semi-auto? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. The war on Guadalcanal was ending, but for John George, a new chapter was being written in the humid classrooms of a makeshift sniper school. Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander, had recognized that what George had accomplished in the Point Cruz groves wasn't just a feat of individual heroism. It was a proof of concept. The American military doctrine of 1943 relied heavily on volume of fire, machine guns, mortars, and semi-automatic rifles. The idea of the lone marksman, the surgical instrument on a battlefield of sledgehammers, had largely been forgotten since the trenches of the First World War. George was tasked with resurrecting it. He was given 14 Springfield M1903 rifles, relics from a previous generation, fitted with long, tubular, unertal scopes. He was given 40 men, all expert marksmen on paper, but none of them had ever looked through a scope at a human being who was looking back. Training began on January 27th, just miles from the front lines. George didn't teach them how to shoot. They already knew how to hit a bullseye. He taught them how to hunt. He taught them that the rifle was secondary to the mind. He taught them how to build a hide using vegetation that wouldn't wilt and give away their position in an hour. He taught them the discipline of the two-man team, shooter and spotter, a concept that would become the bedrock of modern sniper doctrine. The spotter was the brain, calculating range and wind. The shooter was the muscle, executing the command. By February 1st, George had selected 16 teams. They were ready. The results were immediate and devastating. George led 4 teams into the field near the Guadalcanal River to clear out the Japanese rearguard covering the evacuation. The Japanese were retreating to Cape Esperance, moving along narrow jungle trails, assuming they were safe from American infantry who were miles behind. They didn't account for the eyes watching from the ridgelines. On the first day, George paired with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. At 0720, they spotted a Japanese soldier on a resupply trail. The distance was 300 yards. George fired. The soldier dropped. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 targets. 7 shots, 6 kills. 1 miss due to a sudden gust of wind. The other teams reported identical efficiency. By the end of the day, 23 Japanese soldiers lay dead. The Americans had suffered 0 casualties. For 12 days, George's sniper section operated as a phantom force. They moved ahead of the main battalion, sanitizing the jungle, removing machine gun nests and officers before the infantry ever saw them. By February 9th, the section had logged 74 confirmed kills. The actual number was likely higher, but George, ever the perfectionist, only counted bodies that could be visually verified. The psychological impact on the retreating Japanese was profound. They were being picked apart by an enemy they couldn't see, at ranges they couldn't counter. But combat is a game of probabilities, and even the best players eventually draw a bad hand. On February 7th, near the Tanambogo River, George was moving to a new vantage point when a Japanese rifleman, hidden in a spider hole, fired a snapshot. The bullet slammed into George's left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the mud. It was a messy wound, blood soaking his fatigue jacket instantly, but luck was on his side. The round passed through the muscle without shattering the bone or severing an artery. Corporal Hayes dragged him to cover, and Corpsman evacuated him to the rear. As he lay on the stretcher, watching the canopy drift by, John George knew his war on Guadalcanal was over. 2 days later, American forces reached Cape Esperance. The island was secured. The Japanese had fled. Recovery in the field hospital was slow and boring for a man used to the adrenaline of the hunt. But while his shoulder healed, his reputation traveled. Orders arrived from Pacific Command. The Army was assembling a new, classified unit for a suicide mission on the Asian mainland. They needed experienced jungle fighters, officers who could operate behind enemy lines without support for months at a time. The unit was officially designated the 5300 Composite Unit, provisional. History would remember them as Merrill's Marauders. George didn't hesitate. He volunteered. He packed his gear, including the Winchester Model 70. But George was a pragmatist. He knew that the mission in Burma would be different from the static defense of Guadalcanal. They would be marching hundreds of miles over mountains and through jungles where the humidity rotted leather in days. Every ounce mattered. He removed the heavy Lyman Alaskan scope and the robust Griffin and Howe mount, replacing them with a lighter Weaver 330 scope on a simplified mount. He swapped the walnut stock for a lighter synthetic version. He shaved 14 ounces off the rifle. It was no longer a target rifle. It was a tool stripped down for survival. The Marauders arrived in India in April 1943 to train for the impossible. Their objective was the airfield at Myetkina in northern Burma, the only gateway for Allied supplies into China. Between them and the airfield lay 700 miles of the most hostile terrain on Earth, occupied by the Japanese 18th Division. The Marauders were modeled after the British Chindits, long-range penetration groups designed to sow chaos deep in the enemy rear. The march began in February 1944. It was a descent into misery. The Marauders hiked over the Kuman Mountains, hacking their way through bamboo thickets so dense they had to crawl. They were plagued by malaria, dysentery, and typhus. Leeches dropped from the trees in clusters. Men rotted inside their boots. The Winchester Model 70, which had been a sniper's scalpel on Guadalcanal, became a burden on George's back. The nature of the fighting in Burma was different. It wasn't the slow, deliberate stalking of Point Cruz. It was sudden, violent ambushes at point-blank range in the bamboo. The M1 Garand and the Thompson submachine gun were the kings of this jungle. Yet, there were moments when the rifleman was needed. 3 times during the grueling march, the column was pinned down by distant fire. 3 times, Captain John George unslung the bolt-action Winchester. In one engagement, a Japanese officer was directing mortar fire from a ridge 412 yards away. He was beyond the effective range of the infantry's iron sights. George found a rest on a fallen log, calculated the holdover for the Weaver scope, and fired. The officer collapsed. The mortar fire stopped. In another engagement, he silenced a machine gun at 380 yards. The rifle proved that even in the chaos of a movement-to-contact battle, precision still had a place. But the cost was staggering. By the time the marauders reached Mockery in May, the unit was a shell of its former self. Of the 3,000 men who had stepped off, fewer than 200 were considered combat effective. They looked like skeletons, their uniforms hanging off gaunt frames, eyes hollowed by fever and exhaustion. George survived, but he was wasted by disease and fatigue. He had carried his rifle 700 miles, but he realized that the era of the gentleman sniper was ending. The war had become an industrial grinder. Volume of fire was replacing marksmanship. The bolt-action rifle, elegant and precise, was a relic in a world of semi-automatic violence. George was evacuated to the United States in July 1944. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia. His war was over, but his work was not. He spent the remaining months of the conflict trying to institutionalize the lessons he had learned in blood. He taught young officers that a rifle was only as good as the man holding it. He preached the gospel of individual marksmanship in an army that was increasingly focused on mass firepower. When the war ended, George did not fade into obscurity. He was a man of restless intellect. He utilized the GI Bill to attend Princeton University, graduating with highest honors, and later studied at Oxford. He became a diplomat, an expert on African affairs, and a scholar. But the shadow of the jungle never truly left him. In 1947, urged by friends at the National Rifle Association, who knew the legends of Point Cruz, he sat down to write. The result was a book titled Shots Fired in Anger. It was not a typical war memoir. It didn't glorify the killing. It was a technical, cold, and incredibly detailed analysis of combat marksmanship. George dissected the performance of American and Japanese weapons with the eye of a competitive shooter. He wrote about the ballistics of the .30-06 in humid air, the penetration of bullets through coconut logs, and the psychological strain of sniper duels. The book became a cult classic, a Bible for military historians and ballistics experts. It bridged the gap between the target range and the battlefield, proving that the principles of marksmanship remained absolute, regardless of the target. John George lived a long, quiet life after the guns fell silent. He watched the world change. He watched the military struggle to relearn the lessons of the sniper in Korea and Vietnam. He watched as the M14 and eventually the M16 replaced the wood and steel rifles of his youth. He died on January 3, 2009, at the age of 90. His rifle, the Winchester Model 70, serial number 48604, did not disappear into a closet. It was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. Today, it sits behind glass, illuminated by soft museum lights. To the casual observer, it looks unremarkable, just an old sporting rifle with a worn stock and a thin, antiquated scope. It looks like a tool for hunting deer, but lean closer. Look at the scratches on the barrel, the discoloration of the metal where the tropical humidity ate into the bluing. Look at the wear on the bolt handle, smoothed by the hand of a man who cycled it in the mud of Guadalcanal. This rifle is a silent witness to a singular moment in military history. It represents the intersection of civilian skill and military necessity. It is the weapon that cleared the Point Cruz groves when an entire battalion was paralyzed. It is the rifle that proved that one man, with the right tool and the right mind, can change the geometry of a battle. John George was not a super soldier. He was a citizen soldier, a man who took his hobby to war and turned it into an art form. In an age of drone strikes and smart missiles, his story reminds us of a visceral truth. At the tip of the spear, it still comes down to a man, a rifle, and the steady beat of a heart. If this deep dive into the history of the Winchester sniper kept you watching, please hit that like button. It helps these forgotten stories reach a new audience. Subscribe to the channel for more documentaries on the men and machines that defined history. And let us know in the comments, do you think the modern military relies too much on technology and not enough on marksmanship? We read every comment. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next patrol.